In this episode of Broad Strokes, we will see the primary occupiers of male brains collapse. We'll cover how the artistic world dealt with this loss, and with the rise of new religions. Finally, we'll see that even after the fall of Rome, one of its core traditions remained well and truly alive: propaganda. In the late antiquity and early Middle Ages, there were three religions that had a profound impact on the European art world. They were the three main strands of the Abrahamic faiths. Judaism is the oldest of the three, originating with the man who gave his name to these faiths, Abraham. Through his special covenant with God, or Yahweh, his descendants would become the Jewish people. This religion originated within the region of Judea. Christians would come after them, around 30 decades into the CEs. They found their origins in the teachings of Jesus, who they believed to be the Son of God. Originally, they started out as a Jewish sect, but would in time become their own religion that spread far throughout the Roman Empire. The last of the three are the Muslims. Like the Jews, they dispute Jesus' godly parentage. But Muslims believe Jesus, who they call Isa, to be a prophet of God, or Allah. They believe that Muhammad was the primary messenger of Allah. They came a bit late to the party, in 7th century Arabia, but they would spread their faith far throughout the Middle East and North Africa. But I hear you asking, what about art? Well, there's this little book called the Bible. In the Bible you have the Old Testament and a set of 10 rules. In some versions, number 2 says,
"You shall not make icons."
Although with differences, all three religions had at least a similar message about idolatry. So then the age-old question appears: how do we interpret these rules? Well, all three had their own solutions. Jewish art usually didn't depict human figures, although there were exceptions to this rule. But more often they depicted objects of worship. When they depicted Yahweh, they only showed his hands. In Islam, there was a bigger trend of aniconism. Within religious buildings, there's no depiction of human figures, although they still produce some of the most lovely art and architecture in history. Their artistic focus was put to making beautiful calligraphy and vegetal elements. The calligraphic bands often contain Quranic verses or dynastic mottos. After this extremely brief delve into art of Islam and Judaism, we'll now turn our attention to the Christians. The earliest Christian art is found far off the beaten path. See, Christianity came about within the Roman Empire. Generally, the Romans were rather tolerant of religions. But for various reasons, some are shown on screen, the empire distrusted the Christians. Some of these points were also applicable to Judaism. But unlike them, Christianity was a new kid on the block and lacked the respect and prestige of older established religions. Therefore, they became an often used scapegoat for the Roman state. So being forced underground, their earliest art can be found in places like catacombs. Something we can see here is the lack of a clear break with Greco-Roman art. We see that many biblical stories are portrayed using Roman motifs. 2 examples: the Last Supper being portrayed as a Roman dinner, and Jambus Crimbus being displayed as a young Greek hero. A possible cause for this is that in the past art was made by craftsmen. These craftsmen didn't necessarily have to be Christians themselves. So, these pagan craftsmen could have depicted what they were commissioned by using motifs and programs they were accustomed with. One more example is the depiction of Christ shown here, or is the Sol Invictus. Sol Invictus was a Roman sun god with ambiguous origins. His worship grew in popularity during the crisis of the 3rd century. His faith likely inspired some elements of Christian practices. So, when looking at this artwork, one possible interpretation is that pagan craftsmen, again, used motifs they were familiar with for Christian art. One of Sol's adherents was Constantine. I think this guy might become great. Well, this guy is famous for winning the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Allegedly, God gave him a vision of a cross in the sky and told him,
"In hoc signo vinces."
Or,
"With this glow up, slay!"
I just aged 50 years. Anyway, Constantine booted his rival into the river and became the Roman emperor. He was pretty vague about it. He attributed his victory to divine intervention and appeared on coins and monuments with Sol Invictus. So, was he pagan or Christian? ¿Por qué no los dos? His inner politician told him that by playing both sides, he could appeal to both pagan and Christian Romans. Such ambiguity can be found on many artworks from late antiquity. One last example before the empire heads out is the sarcophagus. We see Christ and his disciples, but are depicted like Greek philosophers. Hold on, before the empire does what? So, once Constantine had slayed his way to the top, he eventually converted to Christianity, which had become tolerated following his Edict of Milan in 313. This was followed by some church debates about religious doctrines. Later, under Theodosius I, Christianity even became a state religion. I am now going to grossly oversimplify the fall of Rome. One issue plaguing Rome, it big yo. So for administration, the Romans said, "I sawed this empire in half!" Although they were still officially one state, they were governed as two separate ones. In 476, a few Germanic tribesmen decided that little Romulus Augustus should be the last emperor in the West, while the East kept on vibing for a near millennium. Before we'll talk about what happened after Empire, I once again hear you asking, what about art? Well, let's talk about the differences in the way Rome used art before and after Christianity. See, before, art was used as propaganda supporting the government. Here, art is used to reaffirm the authority of the emperor. But in Christianity, art is used to support a different type of lord. There the focus lay on a spiritual instead of worldly power, and art was used to support the authority of God. For a neat visual example, look no further than Christ dressed like a Roman emperor. Speaking of authority, now that the Western Empire was gone, who would now be in charge of their Christians? Was it the Eastern Emperor, the Patriarch in Constantinople, the Bishop of Alexandria, or the one of Rome? Well, in the West, the latter won out, and started his path to become Pope. This had several reasons. One, well, he was the closest. 2, it was the city where the organized religion kinda started. 3, in theology, St. Peter was hinted to be the leader of the church. And guess who saw themselves as his heir? There were 3 more major questions about religion. First, what is the nature of Christ? Is he the Son of God, human, or God himself? And what does this all say about Mary? Enter the Holy Trinity. But since I'm no theologian, I am not going to touch that one with a long stick. Just know that Mary was determined to be the only human to be born without sin, making her fine to worship. Second, what is the afterlife? There isn't a lot of description about that in the Bible, but it was often interpreted as paradisical gardens in older depictions, like this scene of the Last Judgment in Torcello Cathedral from the 11th century. The story goes from top to bottom. We see Christ's crucifixion, the harrowing of hell, and then the Last Judgment. In such scenes, the viewer's right portrays hell, with the left portraying heaven. Again, we see this paradise-like garden scene. Third, what's up with saints? Well, the Bible doesn't talk about saints. So who decides who are and aren't saints? And what is their position when it comes to worship? Well, in 787 it was decided in Nicaea that you don't worship saints in the same way as God. You adore God, Jesus and Mary, and you venerate saints. To oversimplify, when properly venerating saints, they'd put in a good word for you with a big A. In 1170, the Pope declared that only popes could canonize saints. But who are saints? Well, basically they're super good Christians, who generally belong to these categories. Saints would continue to be declared throughout history. In fact, for my Frisian audience, it was only 2 years ago that a Frisian monk was declared a saint. Actually, on the day this video goes up, it's his feast day. But once more, what about art? We've seen how Muslims and Jews dealt with the whole no veneration of images thing. So how did our Christ then solve this conundrum? Well, for that we need to look at a pope. This is Saint Gregory the Great, henceforth known as Big Greg. Big Greg was quite influential in Western Christianity, as he was an avid church reformer. Big Greg saw his followers becoming more aniconic and iconoclastic, meaning they were turning against images and were destroying them. So Greg laid down 3 functions, or rules, for religious art.
Rule 1.
Throughout history, most people were illiterate, so Big Greg said that images were kind of the book of the layman. Depicting biblical stories in art could help someone memorizing important tales from scripture. An example of this are the early 11th century Bernward doors of the Hildesheim Cathedral. They depict the story of Eve to the left and Mary to the right. They help visitors memorize the stories of these 2 biblical women. Although funny story, these doors might have been made by Bishop Bernward of Hildesheim because he was peeved that Abbess Sophia, the abbess of nearby Gandalfsheim and a daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, had authority over him. So he wanted to link her to Eve to show that, look, women are weaker than men. I mean, petty, sexist, but still pretty cool looking doors.
Rule 2.
art should inspire feelings of devotion. I mean, picture this. When we visit a pre-Gothic church, it's all nice and lit up. But this wouldn't be the case for contemporary visitors. In older churches, the windows were often smaller due to limitations in construction techniques. So these churches might have been lit up by some candles during ceremonies. And when you look at the priest, surrounded by these golden mosaics, lit up by the few light beams from the outside and a reflecting candlelight, you are left in awe and are completely captivated by the sermon given by the priest.
Rule 3!
Art should stimulate the memory of their predecessors. So one important aspect of religious art in Christianity, when relating it to the whole second commandment thing, is that you shouldn't worship the images themselves, but you should worship or venerate the person that is being depicted. So the last function stipulated that art could be used to help the masses remember religiously significant persons. These could be, for example, the patron of a church, biblical figures, or saints. Basically, art could be used to inspire people to live just as piously as the depicted figures. Art in churches would follow these three functions for centuries, and they sort of represent a medieval art theory. But one more thing I hear is important in religion are the temples where it takes place. So before we head off today, let's talk a little bit about church architecture. An issue we sort of touched on in the video on the art of antiquity, Greco-Roman temples were a rather closed-off space. The interior was mainly reserved for rituals by priests. So, when Constantine took the plunge, he took it upon himself to organize the Christian faith. And since Constantine had made Christianity publicly practicable, they wanted to practice this religion in a more public structure. Next to this, most existing Roman temples had too much pagan baggage. So the decision of what building to worship in landed on an already existing structure, the basilica. There are three primary definitions of basilica, two functional definitions and one formal definition. A basilica was a large building in Roman antiquity, it's an honorific given to certain Catholic churches, and it's an architectural type of church. I'm not getting into the second definition, because no theologian. The basilica in Roman society was basically just a huge public building that was used for public administration. It was multi-purposed. It served, for example, as a large bazaar, but also as a courtroom. During the imperial period, these halls were often adorned by statues of the emperor or his family members, one of which was the Colossus of Constantine, where his famous headshot comes from. Here you can see how it might have looked on sight. Such statues reminded the people of who blessed them with such magnificent structures and who was responsible for justice and commerce throughout the empire. Like I keep saying about the Romans, those crafty bastards had a knack for propaganda. The last definition is pointing us towards a specific church plan. As we've seen, the Romans mastered building big interiors. So the Christians, looking for a big open space for their religious ceremonies, chose the basilica as their new gathering place. The architectural type of a basilica church consists of a central nave with at least two adjacent side aisles. For a church to be a basilica type, it needs to have a clerestory that allows light to enter the nave through windows above the lower side aisles. Basilicas traditionally had an apse at its end, where the altar is located. This type of construction would come to dominate Western Christianity, often with an added transept that created a cross-shaped plan. The most important element of the church is the altar, which was always located at the eastern end, orientating the churches with their entrance, or narthex, to the west, and having visitors oriented to the east for theological reasons. The Eastern Orthodox Church went a different route, on which I won't dwell too long because, that would really need its own video. But the basilica is what we call an axial plan. Here the focus is on the longer axis. Whereas Byzantine churches often follow the centralized plan. Here the focus is on verticality. The funniest thing is, the Hagia Sophia, the archetype of Byzantine churches, is actually a basilica in disguise and is not centrally planned. For good examples of centrally planned Byzantine churches, we could look at the San Vitale in Ravenna or the Little Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. But to summarize this entire video, the Christians continued Roman traditions, customs and institutions, but they gave them a new context. Instead of the emperor at the heart of civilization, it was now the church. Instead of the basilica being a place of civil administration and glorification of the emperor, it became a place of worship. And because they copied the Romans, art was also an excellent medium for propaganda. Next time on Brushing History, we'll see how the presumed heirs of Western Rome tried to artistically interpret their imperial past and their Christian future. But for now, if this video made you long for the eternal glory of Rome, then maybe rethink that because their toilets were communal, their healthcare was pretty lackluster, And if you were poor, your houses were pretty shoddy. But here in the 21st century, from the comfortable safety of your own well-designed bathroom, you can give this video a like, comment, and press the subscribe button. And if you want to be notified when the next video is uploaded, then don't forget to click the bell icon. Have a good one and see y'all next time.